Hi, I'm Ken Howard, and welcome to the Gay Therapy LA podcast. Today, I would like to talk about gay men in common crisis situations and steps for handling them. There'll be a handful of those. We'll get to those. Let's talk about what that is. Gay men in crisis are usually experiencing an event that is outside your everyday routine, and it requires a special response. It involves a rallying of what I call internal resources, such as calm, focus, determination, courage, persistence, as well as outside resources. And these could include things like emergency medical help, psychiatric emergency response, crisis counseling, aid from the police, legal services, paperwork processes, internet resources, and real goods, such as a place to stay if your home got flooded. Managing a crisis involves identifying and rallying both your internal and your external resources. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. When you're facing a crisis, you want to assess the situation and then develop a response that will restore you back to previous equilibrium, the way things were before the crisis occurred, as much as ever is possible anyway. So, as a therapist and a coach who's specialized in helping gay male individuals and couples in therapy and coaching for a long time, 28 years now, I'm often called upon to help guys in crisis situations. So, I'd like to share a list of some common situations of crisis that anyone could face, but each of them has some special considerations for gay men due to various social, legal, political, or cultural pressures. And these are things that I've seen in my practice for a long time, but it always goes up and down the number of people that I'm working with who are in some kind of crisis situation. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some things to keep in mind to manage and even prevent the worst of crises that you can face. So let's go down our list. Number one, in no particular order, workplace discrimination or a workplace bullying incident. So while other demographics can certainly face discrimination, racial, religious, gender, all that, gay men can frequently be the victims of workplace discrimination. I've worked with a number of guys over the years facing this, and our work sometimes consists of reacting and responding to the incident in a proper legal way, such as making a report to human resources. And I've also referred clients to various attorneys who help clients file claims against the offending entity. While anti-gay workplace discrimination is still maddeningly very legal in many states, we need to look at future legislation on the federal level that makes employment discrimination against LGBT people illegal in all states. But right now it's legal in some states, particularly those that have Republican majorities and where, anti-LGBT, conservative and social religious sentiment, defends legal discrimination against LGBT people. It is illegal in California, where I live, and many of my clients who have filed legal complaints and lawsuits have achieved good settlements, like cash, a lot of times over $100,000 each for their troubles, although they would rather have not gone through the whole thing anyway, even if they got a large settlement after a large amount of heartache. And, so there's many times where I've seen justice served well, and we can thank our attorneys and our LGBT legal clinics and all kinds of good resources for helping these guys to get justice. But that's the legal side. There's also the personal side. And experiencing discrimination can be shocking, frightening, disorienting, and even enraging. So while a lawyer or a mediator or arbitrator can help with the practical and legal side, workplace interpersonal events that are not necessarily physical violence, but they are emotional violence from one person at an organization to another. I experienced this in my own career at nonprofit organizations where I used to work before I was in private practice. And in one particular place, which was actually an AIDS service organization in Los Angeles, can you imagine that? I was the victim of both HIV discrimination and sex discrimination as a male in an all-female office. My husband, for example, was the victim of anti-gay discrimination when he worked at a museum in Los Angeles County, where a new female executive vice president, abusing her power through her bigotry, systematically forced out every gay male in her department over time, over a couple of years. Some of my clients have been victims of anti-gay slurs or denied opportunities, and others have been the victims of workplace violence. One friend had a male boss at a big movie studio who threw a chair at him when he got mad, and he settled for enough money in the legal settlement to pay for his MBA. While all of these examples and more ultimately had happy endings where the victim turned into thriving survivors, at the time of the crises they didn't feel so good. And dealing with things like workplace discrimination requires rallying of a whole support system made up of people in your professional and your personal realms, and identifying and implementing a series of steps for what social workers like to call adaptive coping to a crisis situation. So these steps of adaptive coping can include items A through E. Item A, it's first of all, it's staying calm and taking some time to quietly think about what has happened. And sometimes that can be done in session with me. B is thinking about who can help and getting consultation with them. Who are your partners in this? Who are the supporting cast of characters that help you? The people who serve as interpersonal resources and sources of support for you. Item C is thinking about verbal reports and paperwork and calls and emails that have to be made. Number D, taking steps to write down and document the sequence of events, who, what, when, where, why, including the names, the dates, the times, the locations, and the circumstances. Now, these would be critical for a legal case. Your attorney is going to want things that are very factual, as best you can possibly remember. So you write down what happened in kind of a narrative or a timeline. And you also think of people who were with you at the time that could later serve as witnesses. And so if you're forced out or if you're laid off, copying documents that are relevant to your claim onto a zip drive or email them to yourself in the last days or even hours that you have at your desk that would support documentation for your case, including things like contact information for colleagues and things like that. So if you're in that situation and you're forced out or laid off, if you have the time, try and collect with you the things that you would need to fight back later. What to keep in mind in these kinds of things are the objective things, like the timeline and the documents, and then also get support for the emotional and personal side. Because being the victim of an interpersonal workplace conflict, like discrimination or workplace bullying, is really an adult trauma. And you might even have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which a therapist could tell you more about. Because it's not like a gay bashing kind of crisis where you're physically hurt, but it's an interpersonal, it's kind of a white collar trauma, if you will. It feels like you've been the victim of a crime because you have been. So that's workplace discrimination, and we have far too many cases of that, and lots of LGBT people have had to fight back against that, and it's a constant battle in our legal system and with human resources departments all over the country. The other kind of crisis, this is number 2 on the list, is some kind of financial setback. Many things can create a financial setback: a sudden tax bill, a dip in the business that you own or run, if you have income property, a tenant who moves out and you're losing the rent income, a sudden large home repair, something that breaks or needs replacement and it's expensive to replace or fix, being laid off from your job, that's kind of one of the ultimate ones in a financial setback, getting a lousy raise or a bonus that you expected and it's much less than you thought it was going to be and that you were banking on, so to speak. That can be a financial setback. A big medical bill, those can be negotiated oftentimes with the doctor's office or with the hospital institution. But a big medical bill, you're on the hook for that in a lot of cases, at least in the current American healthcare system. And it's a big driver of bankruptcy in America. It's a big social and political problem. Or even an economic downturn, where the financial setbacks are for everybody because it's the whole economy that takes a downturn in the stock market and things like that. And that could be local to your region in some kind of a field, or it can be the whole country, or it could be the whole world, like the global recession that we had a number of years back. So here's the coping for the financial setback crisis. A through D. A is just acknowledging the loss, taking it in. The setback has happened, now what is it, and how do I feel about it? B is assessing your finances, doing a kind of tedious accounting of what's coming in terms of income, what's going out in terms of your bills, identifying which of those expenses can be cut or eliminated, which ones can be reduced, and what can be cultivated as an adaptive coping measure. Do you take on a second job temporarily? Do you get some kind of a loan? Do you seek out a loan from a bank or a credit union? Or do you think about doing a family loan and thinking about the family boundaries in that? Do you get a loan from a friend? Is there something you could sell? Is there something you could do as kind of a side gig to keep you afloat? And learning a lot, and social workers, I have to say, are particularly good about this. Could you access an unemployment program in your state? Can you access some kind of a disability program in your state? California is great on these, but poorer states are not, particularly states where the political will does not fund a lot of social services, whereas in California the political will funds a lot of social services. And it's a political climate thing about what resources are available there. Number C, getting advice from free, like online sources, or even inexpensive resources. Books such as, people like Susie Orman, the lesbian financial planner who had a TV show. She has some great books about coping with financial crisis. Jane Bryant Quinn is another financial guru. And you could get, used paperback copies of these books on Amazon for cheap, but the advice in them about how to handle a financial setback in very practical terms would be very important. And you have to be very proactive with those things, because two people can experience the same financial hardship, but if they cope with it in different ways, they're going to have a different outcome. There might be some more expensive options, but still worth investing in, such as consulting a certified financial planner, or some type of professional tax advisor, or some kind of financial house broker, or even just talking to your bank, and talking to each creditor that you owe money to, and negotiating a good faith effort to make some kind of reduced payment. Communication is really key. The last thing creditors want to see from you is being ignored. They get an abandonment anxiety or an abandonment rage, as we shrinks would call it. So over communicating with your creditors, and eventually they'd be like, whatever, don't worry about it. But if you ignore them, they're going to be like, hey, where's my money? So you want to work with them, use the psychological angle to your advantage, and preventing the anxiety and rage that comes from the perception that you're devaluing or abandoning them. That's a trick that I've worked with on my clients for years on managing major debt, and I've really seen it work over and over again. Number D is making a plan for recovery from the financial setback. So you do a new job search, and you get skills for a new field if you have to. You access benefits such as the disability pay or workers' comp if you're injured, or unemployment benefits, negotiating payment plans, like we said, with your creditors, even consulting an attorney regarding your options about bankruptcy if you have to, making a new business plan. If you own a small business and you have some kind of a setback, you may have to make a new business plan so that you're responding to the current community. You might have to change the way you advertise. I did that. I used to advertise my practice in print in the gay publications. Well, the gay publications in print went the way of the dinosaur, so I changed to online advertising. So sometimes you have to invest in business consultation, especially with a business coach. I've done that a lot. And, you have to spend money to save money sometimes and get excellent expert advice. You have to downsize your personal budget. Do you sell your luxury car and buy something that's reliable but more modest and then pocket the difference to pay down some of your debt? So a financial setback is one of the crises that gay men can face. And sometimes gay men have, white or male privilege in society, and so we might earn more. And then sometimes some studies show that gay men actually earn less than straight men. And we're not sure why, but we think that discrimination has a big part of that. But a financial setback is definitely a crisis that, in my experience and observation, it causes a lot of anxiety for people, especially for gay men, because we have the setback and then we're doing that in a context of being a social minority. Number 3, in terms of crisis, it would be a car accident. This is, common on a national level, but it's rare in terms of maybe people or your own history. And we have to start off that by saying any car accident that you survive, and others too, is considered a good one. Coping with this usually involves calling your insurance company and sometimes the police if there's major property damage, and certainly if anyone's injured. Attending to any medical needs comes first. Then things like exchanging information about car insurance with the other drivers, taking photos with your phone to document the incident. I think that's important in terms of if the other side tries to claim damage that actually didn't happen, or you documenting damage that did happen as a result of someone else's driving mistakes, and you need to document the magnitude of that damage. And at the site of the accident, making sure everyone is out of the way and out of any kind of further risk if it's happening on a busy street, so you get everybody to the side of the road. A call to your insurance agent can help a lot because those staff are trained to deal with crisis calls from the field. But the second part of it is coping with the emotional side, the sudden loss of your car and the use of it, or looking at a car that you thought was very beautiful and then it's very physically damaged with the metal and the plastic and the glass and all that stuff. And I've worked with guys in therapy coming to terms with the loss of a beloved vehicle. It sounds funny at first, but it's actually a real thing, because they might be coping with a physical injury or loss, and that's the main thing and the serious thing. But they might have traumatic symptoms, again, related to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And, so a lot of gay men living in urban areas that are congested with cars, and some gay men have that kind of typical male, gay or straight, special relationship to their cars. As Shania Twain said, "I can't believe you kissed your car goodnight." Well, sometimes we feel that way about our cars. We're proud of them, and we treasure them and really cherish them. But even in an accident where there are no physical injuries, there can still be a traumatic loss of something that you invested in, something that you took pride in, and just something that you enjoyed. So, as with the other types of crises, making a plan to attend to both the practical and the emotional sides of what happens to you makes up what we call the adaptive coping response. Number 4 is a household disaster crisis, because just like cars, gay men can take special pride in their homes, which we can have an appreciation for the aesthetic. That's kind of a gay man's thing, to have nice aesthetics in our home. And maybe even some competitiveness, keeping up with the Joneses kind of thing. Gay men are great at, competing on an aesthetic level, whether it's their body or their haircut or their clothes or their home or their car. So if a pipe bursts, or a fire flares up in your kitchen, or you get leakage from another home, such as in an apartment or a condo, or another disaster like a tree falling on your property or a sewer pipe breaks, a pool cracks. These can shake the foundation, figuratively and then literally, in like an earthquake. And your sense of safety and comfort in your home as a sanctuary safe from the world is threatened. And that can really upset our equilibrium, because home is supposed to be a place where we let our hair down and relax. So like the other crises, this involves the practical external resources such as firefighters, water disaster management companies, plumbers, tree surgeons, pool engineers. But then it's the internal resources of how to make the place where you live feel safe again. And sometimes this means making another location your home and hearth for a little while, or even a permanent change of residence. I had the experience a number of years ago where the office where I practiced, my private practice in therapy, burned down. And I found another office within a week, and I've been there for 6 years. But I wrote a blog article on that on gaytherapyla.com, Tales from a Crispy Couch, and it was about. Fortunately, it wasn't my home, but it was about what happens when the fire happens to your office building, and things that I lost and how I coped, and relied on the help of some really good friends and colleagues that helped get me through that. Number 5 on our list of crises is the loss of a loved one, the illness or death of a family member. So one book that I always recommend for clients who are in severe emotional crisis due to the breakup or a loss of a loved one, a family, a friend, a pet, is called How to Survive the Loss of a Love. And that's, I think, perhaps the most difficult crisis situation that there is, with the possible exception of a sudden medical injury or illness to your person. And so while death, is a fact of life, the death of a loved one or their sudden illness or a medical crisis is never easy, and it carries, again, many of the aspects of a traumatic event. It can easily cause post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. So bereavement counseling after the death of a loved one can be a major component to the duties of a therapist, because death and other major loss are common human experiences, regardless of your place in history or your geographic location or what demographic or ethnicity you are. We will all experience the death of loved ones. It's very common, and yet when it happens, it's devastating. So the number one thing in coping with this type of crisis is rallying emotional support from as many different sources as possible, because many things can help in bereavement. Comfort from a partner or spouse, say if you lose a parent or a sibling. Other family members, your friends, even neighbors can be personal supports. And comfort from professional supports might include your doctor, who might prescribe you a sleep aid if you're having trouble sleeping after experiencing someone's death. Professionals like a funeral director who can help out with all those practical things in losing someone. Maybe you attend a bereavement support group in your area. And of course therapy. In addition to things like books or audio or websites about how to cope with the loss and death of a loved one. In order to incorporate a major loss into your life, part of it is that it just takes time. Bereavement and grief that is facilitated in some way through a therapist or a group, that can facilitate the process of grieving. It may even shorten the duration of the time of intensity, of intense grief. And I've seen this with a lot of clients. I think my favorite kind of approach with this is being educated and kind of reassured by the major stages of grief that were made famous by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. They were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Let me repeat those. Kubler-Ross's stages: denial, kind of a numbness that it's happened. Anger, how could this happen? How could they do this? Oh, I hate, whatever took them out. the hashtag fuck cancer, things like that was an anger against people we've lost to cancer. Bargaining, I'm going to keep their spirit alive by doing something in their honor. Depression of just feeling the loss. And ultimately acceptance that they have left our lives and we survive and we somehow honor their memory. But these 5 stages are not linear in nature. They can come and go in any order, and each stage can be revisited, even more than once. Time does heal, but so does having interpersonal support, and therapy can help a person make meaning from loss and trauma. For gay men, the loss of a loved one can force them to revisit losing peers. If you lived at the height of the deaths from the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, then from death, death became familiar to those of us who lived through that time. And it was so specific to gay men because gay men were affected by AIDS more than any other population. And yet we were also isolated because there were some people who either didn't know or really didn't care. And, and there were even some who said that we deserved it. So not only did we have the grieving, but we also had the bashing and the abuse on top of it. Not from many, but, even one is too many who said, oh, we deserved it, or it's God's wrath. And, there were a lot of politics about that, of, oh, just let him die, it's just the gay men, which, of course, causes rage. One of the reasons why I'm so passionate about defending the gay community and fighting HIV stigma is because of the injuries and the indignities that gay men who were dying experienced at the height of the AIDS crisis. And that starts to feel like a long time ago, but the impact of witnessing that never goes away. So that's why I can be fiery in my activism against political factions that denigrate the LGBT community in general and gay men in particular, is because of what I lived through the AIDS crisis. And, there's also, not only the height of the AIDS crisis, but also, if you've lost a loved one through some kind of violence, through violent crime or a gay bashing, and that's compounded because then not only is it the loss of a loved one, but it's the loss of a loved one through some kind of injustice or violent crime, which is much more difficult to get over because it was preventable. Gay widowers can experience an invalidation of their loss. It's as if their same-sex relationship was not as good as a straight widower's experience. My mentor in New York years ago, Michael Chernoff, wrote a book called Gay Widowers, and it was a collection of stories from gay men who had been widowed, especially by the AIDS crisis, and about the dual coping that's required. Again, it's the loss of a loved one through often a premature death, not just someone who died, at an older age after a full life expectancy, but some kind of premature death, often to AIDS. But then also the invalidation, because gay widowers do not get as much social support as straight widowers do. And that's the men. With women, it could be the same thing with lesbian relationships. Number 6, in terms of the crises that can happen, is a business crisis. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but since I work with so many gay men in West Hollywood and Los Angeles, and the economy of Los Angeles, if you don't live there, if you don't know, it includes a lot of self-employed people, because there's only a few big companies in LA, the Walt Disney Company or some of the movie studios, but there's not a lot of Fortune 500 companies in Los Angeles. So the economy of this sprawling city includes many self-employed people. And I often hear the crises that are related to challenges caused by downturns in business or some kind of an economic blip, or even something like a recession, which is not really a blip, it's much more prolonged. So helping these guys often involves applying my skills and experience in executive coaching and career coaching and job issues. I've done a lot of that in my career, and there's a lot of call for that in my practice of guys who want career coaching or executive coaching as a service that I provide. The idea of work means a lot for everyone. But for gay men, we can sometimes have an extra focus on our careers because most of the time we don't have children to raise. So when our business is doing well, we thrive and we enjoy the great things in life, and we sometimes can enjoy luxuries depending on where we are and what kind of business we have and what kind of income that provides. So when things are disappointing, we really feel it. Like other crises, this involves assessing the situation and identifying and cultivating resources and options. So when you run a business, this can mean finding ways to cut expenses or increase revenue within that business. So unlike other crises, a business crisis is often a growing pain in your professional life, and it can be what my friend Casey Truffaut, who's a very, very talented business coach, calls the gift wrapped in dirty paper. And while we experience a crisis in business beyond managing the scary and depressing aspects of loss, we can find new ways to grow our business, to make it more socially relevant to our clients and customers, to cultivate new skills, adapt new technology, form new networking relationships with colleagues, and even to some degree with competitors, and learn about our product or our service and the market, either a local market or a national or global market, and we strengthen the weak spots in our business to inoculate ourselves against future loss. And that's how you grow a business over time, is making it more and more commercially and socially responsive to the market that keeps your business afloat. And it's responding to trend spotting and demographic changes. My identity as a gay men specialist therapist is there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences from when I started 28 years ago because it's a different climate. The height of the AIDS crisis is not as pressing on us. There's more opportunity, but we're living in a different economy now, especially with young people, because young people in their, say, early to mid-20s do not have the same commercial opportunities coming out of college in general that they did when I was that age, a generation ago. It's a different type of national and global economy, and I think it's a lot more difficult now for young people to get started. It used to be you graduated college, you got a job with full salary and benefits, and you could afford to rent a one-bedroom apartment on your own. Almost no 24-year-old that I know can do that unless they get major parental support. Once in a while, if they've been to business school or they're a big consultant or something like that, but for most guys in their 20s, most gay men in their 20s that I see, they're having a tougher time of it, and that becomes a political and social issue. But when you're running a business, it's about making what you do relevant to the commercial market. If you provide a relevant product or service, you'll make money at it, and you'll succeed, and you'll enjoy the fruits of those success. But in a business crisis, we have to really respond to that, and I really think that almost always requires therapy and coaching, because to do it on your own is just too isolating. Number 7, we got to watch out for just a DUI, a driving under intoxication, drunk driving. In the age of Uber and Lyft and all that stuff, we really shouldn't have many of these, and those are great resources. That is a big game changer in the history of transportation, are the ride-sharing apps, because the risk of drinking and driving is much reduced. And for gay men, gay male culture can still be centered quite a bit on bars and clubs in the major gay cities of the world. Although, this is changing somewhat because there's other opportunities for gay men to socialize, like softball groups or game groups or hiking groups or whatever. But anytime there's alcohol involved, like a bar or a club or a house party, it can include driving, and that is a dangerous and expensive combination. Getting a citation for driving under the influence can be a profound existential wake-up call, and it usually means that we have to really consider mindfully and sensitively what I call our relationship to alcohol or another substance like cocaine or whatever. I explore a lot of this in other articles on gaytherapyla.com. There's Getting Clean from Green about using too much marijuana. Marijuana is not known as being a hardcore drug, but even that, if you use too much of it, it can be problematic. And I've worked with guys on that. There's some other stuff about cocaine, and certainly, of course, with meth and with alcohol. So explore on the blog tab on gaytherapyla.com. Use the search box, search cocaine, search marijuana, search meth, and you'll find a number of articles that I've written about how gay men deal with these kinds of substances. But recovering from getting a DUI involves managing any legal tasks or mandates, like mandated driver's ed and stuff like that, to coping with the financial impact from legal fines and fees, and also going through a soul-searching process about what needs to change in order to prevent this kind of charge, the DUI charge, and its related risks of disaster if you kill somebody or really hurt yourself in the future. So in my practice, I apply models such as the harm reduction model and another one called motivational interviewing, as well as cognitive behavioral therapy. And all of these are evidence-based practice models for therapy, which means they've been vetted for positive outcomes in formal academic and clinical research. And I help guys deal with reducing or controlling or managing their alcohol or drug use and helping them to either achieve or sustain sobriety. But this varies depending on the guy I'm working with and an assessment of their goals, and different kinds of services for addiction recovery. That can be AA, but a lot of gay men find Alcoholics Anonymous to be too religious-based, especially if they're agnostic or atheist, or they've been so abused by religious resources that they're traumatized from their religious experience and they want nothing to do with the religiosity of AA. And so they get sober just through outpatient psychotherapy. And that can work. I've seen that work in my practice quite a bit. SMART, S-M-A-R-T, Smart Recovery is an AA alternative. But even if it's just kind of a fluke where you don't need to stop drinking entirely, but you've gotten a DUI through just some kind of weird perfect storm of elements, it involves coping with the actual event and the humiliation of being stopped by a police officer and all that can entail. But it's also dealing with the risky environment in which it happened, and how to develop tools for being able to socialize as gay men and have fun in our communities, but to guard against any risk to our emotional and physical and legal and social and financial safety. Because a DUI is just a crisis in and of itself. Number 8, this last one in the list, is what I call a sexual mistake. We don't get a lot of discussion about this, but in my identity as a gay men's specialist therapist and coach, and as a trained sex therapist, and I'm doing more and more sex therapy and sex coaching work for guys in California as therapy, and really all over the country and all over the world now through phone or webcam services. We look at the sexual issues, and it's a big topic, sex. But the sexual mistake, is not limited to gay men, but they can lead to a crisis of its own. So sleeping with someone that you legally or socially shouldn't, that really should not happen, like sleeping with somebody who's underage. That is statutory rape, and it is very damaging to the victim, and it's really something to avoid. But if that somehow happens, then a person really needs to rally and get help for that, and not just get bogged down in stigma, but to actually get really well-informed, emotionally mature support for how to prevent that as a perpetrator. Or maybe it's just someone you shouldn't sleep with through some kind of interpersonal relationship, like sleeping with somebody's roommate and it creates an awkward situation for you and your friends, something like that. It's not illegal, but it's socially awkward. doing something that exposes you to an HIV transmission risk, risking some kind of legal consequence, such as a lewd conduct arrest, if you're hooking up like in a public bathroom or a public park, and someplace where a police officer might arrest you for lewd conduct or indecent exposure. Those laws are controversial, but they do exist. Any kind of sexual experience, having sex with someone that you regret later, can all be considered sexual mistakes that you wish that you could do over. This can be a small crisis, such as just, feelings of guilt, or a major crisis, such as an upset to a relationship, like if you break a monogamy agreement. Or it can be a risk to your employment, such as sleeping with a subordinate in an office setting, or with a colleague, which can open you up to like a sexual harassment charge in your workplace. And while I differ from therapists who label these behaviors sex addiction, which is, more and more discredited, that is not a legal or even a clinical diagnosis. It's been rejected by the book on, the Bible of psychiatric disorders, the DSM, by the American Psychiatric Association. Sex addiction is not a legitimate diagnosis. There's a lot of debate about that. And some therapists, even some gay therapists, try to label any kind of sexual mistake as a symptom of sex addiction, and it's not. That's a very problematic label to put on people, and it's very culturally based, and it's very moralistic and religious based, and it misses the point on some other clinical issues. So I prefer a whole different approach. And I talk about this on my website, on Gay Therapy, called sexual self-empowerment. Sexual self-empowerment is saying yes when you want to say yes, without guilt or explanation, and assuming it's with a consenting adult, and saying no when you want to say no, also without guilt or explanation. It's your body. You decide what happens with it. And we use, in my practice, evidence-based models and diagnostics that are more professionally accepted. And if some kind of sexual mistake can easily cause a crisis, even if it's just something like a scare, where there might have been a risk of HIV transmission but it doesn't happen, or even just, catching an STD, which can feel humiliating even though there's nothing really wrong with that, it's just biology, and you get, tested and treated, but it can make people feel bad. So counseling on the sexual mistake can certainly be helpful, but it brings up a lot of themes about what are your values in terms of what's comfortable for you to do or not do, what are your choices that you want to make, how do you live authentically with your sexual self, is what's happening sexually and what you want to happen sexually the same thing, and if not, then how do we work to close the gap? There's a personal accountability about what you will and won't do. There's a self-awareness about how much do you really know about your sexual self. How do you deal with guilt if you did something that you know is socially or even legally wrong? How do you cope with social pressures to do or not do something? How do you deal with social prejudices and double standards? Where I live in Los Angeles, there's been an old joke that Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood is generally where the gay guys are. Sunset Boulevard is, Sunset Strip and the rock and roll clubs. So, if you have sex on somebody's front lawn off of Santa Monica Boulevard, it's considered lewd conduct and they'll arrest you. If you're a straight couple and you have sex on somebody's lawn above Sunset Boulevard in the Hollywood Hills, ooh, it's hot. Straight sex in a bathroom or in some kind of, public place is considered hot by the cops. But then if two gay guys do that, it's considered lewd conduct, especially historically. And it's a double standard between gay and straight couples having sex in public places. And the law enforcement is notoriously imbalanced against gay men. But there could also be cultural or religious or economic influences about the sexual mistake. Maybe something isn't illegal at all, but it goes against a religious value that you hold, and then you might feel conflicted. And then therapy can help you to reconcile the conflict that you feel between your sexuality and your spirituality. And much of the recovery from the sexual mistake as a kind of crisis involves a lot of self-compassion, and it can really help to process it with a therapist. So finally, the crises in our lives involve quite a bit of existential self-reflection. No one gets out of this life alive. And by middle age, most of us realize that we cannot get through life without trials and tribulations of some kind fairly frequently. And both the ones that we receive and the ones we inflict on others, even unintentionally. We have to have realistic expectations of life. And to paraphrase Shakespeare, our lives are as a fabric, a weave of good and ill. So while we can't stop crisis events from happening to us or to our loved ones or in the world, we can believe in and commit ourselves to positive concepts like lifelong learning, skill building, resilience, personal growth, compassion, and meaning. Jack Canfield, who's one of my favorite authors, he wrote The Success Principles, How to Get From Where You Are to Where You Want to Be, one of my favorite books. He said that event plus response equals outcome. We can't prevent crisis events from occurring in our lives, at least some of the time. But we can control our adaptive coping response to them, and this can change the ultimate outcome very dramatically, for better or for worse. The better our response to the event, the better the ultimate outcome is going to be. So we really have to make a skill of what our response is to events that happen that are not in our control. And that's what adaptive coping means. And the skill of adaptive coping is something that a therapist or a coach can help you to cultivate through your work with them. Life gives us both joys and challenges, and how we cope with those challenges informs our character and our quality of life for the long term. Thanks. I'll see you next time.